Beginning, we have to shout at the beginning. Okay. I'm going to shout at the beginning. Okay? uh, as Dr. Sharfstein said in his memorial, Paul Fink was a leader extraordinaire. In addition to being past president of GAP, Dr. Fink was past president of the American Psychiatric Association, the American College of Psychiatrists, the National Association of Psychiatric Health Systems, and the American Association of Chairmen of Departments of Medical Schools of Psychiatry. He was the founding chair on the Committee of Marketing and Communications. He wanted to expand GAP and have it known throughout the world. And around today, we have the photographer, and the website is going to get bigger and bigger. He would have been eager to discuss the presentations of our fellows as they talk about guns and violence, and unfortunately, but he's not here today. He, like I, was concerned about the mentally ill in jails and prisons, and the increase. Given back in the 1960s, it was 5% of the mentally ill in jails. Now it's 20%. I had the good fortune of working on this and filming him talking about the closure of the state hospitals. I must admit, the two of us felt very differently about it. He felt it was really good that the state hospital in Philadelphia had closed, and he describes, as you'll see in the DVD of him, the way they treated patients. In Los Angeles, the Metropolitan State Hospital was a really good hospital. In Camarillo, which is closed completely now and has a university on it, was a marvelous state hospital. But we felt really bad when the closures happened, and supposedly the money that was saved was going to come for community services and diversion opportunities, but the money never came. But I do want to show you a little bit of Paul back a few years ago in Hawaii when we filmed him. And I've got my helper here who's going to, because I am computerly challenged. This is back in the Hawaii meeting. Is this sound? If you remember back in Hawaii, 2012, when the American Psychiatric Association...
In 1955, that's what you had, state hospitals. Here we are 50 years later, and the state hospitals are minimal. And many of them are acting like general hospitals. Short lengths of stay, etc. There's no place to send a patient if a patient needs long-term care. And there are people who need long-term care. The idea that they threw everybody out of hospitals in the 70s, that was the mistake. They should have had some provision for people who need custodial care for their whole lives. And we didn't even think of that. We were just interested in saving money and getting them out. And we found in every hospital in the country a horror story. Somebody who had been there for 40 years and wasn't mentally ill. We had one in Byberry, spoke only Czech, and they didn't know that. So she was there for 40 years.
So were there abuses, or is that just kind of trumped up?
Abuses meaning what?
Like what in the state hospital system, did they deserve to be closed?
Well, it's not a matter of whether they deserved. There was a general sense that we were spending a fortune on state hospitals when we could have used that money for local community care. And the woman who orchestrated the closure of Byberry, which had 6,000 beds, all filled, forced the state to give her the money to open up community mental health centers in Philadelphia, $90 million. So that was the beginning of something very, very powerful. I think that most of the state hospitals deserve to be closed or reduced. It wasn't a matter of abuse. You know, the whole question of warehousing is true. People were put into places and had no care. They had nobody doing what we do for people in the hospital nowadays. Making sure they got their medicines, making sure they got a bath. You know, when I was a medical student, I was taken on a tour of Byberry, and they stopped us in front of a room 6 times the length of this room. It had 50 naked people in it, all of whom were severely regressed psychotics. And they would move their bowels and urinate on the floor. A few times a day, somebody would come in and hose down the floor.
Talking about the psychiatric hospitals, and unfortunately, the psychiatric hospitals closed, and the numbers went down in terms of the numbers in psychiatric hospitals, and they went up in jail. He would really want to be here today to comment on your presentation. Thank you so much.
Hello, GAP members. My name is David Freeman, and it is my great pleasure to begin the plenary presentation of the Ginsberg Fellows, titled Psychiatry and Gun Violence: The Psychiatrist as Educator, Protector, and Clinician. Let's begin with an overview of firearms. Of developed countries, the U.S. far and away has the largest volume of firearms. Our homicide rate dwarfs that of other countries by orders of magnitude. Now, this is a busy infographic, but the Americas are the upper middle circle, and the red semicircle shows, again, how homicide by firearm is the largest proportion of homicide deaths. The left chart shows rates of various kinds of violence in the U.S. over time. What is important is that while the rate of violence and victimization has decreased since the early 90s, the rate of firearm homicide, the blue line, has been steady since 1997. Over time, we can become desensitized to the problem of gun violence. News clips like the following wash over society.
If you are just joining us, 2 young men apparently dressed in long black trench coats opened fire about an hour and a half ago at a high school just outside of Denver in Littleton, Colorado. At least 3 students have been injured and possibly as many as 8. Getting more information in on Virginia Tech and the situation there. First, I want to show you this new video that we just got in from the scene. According to the latest updates, 2 people have been fatally shot on the campus. One is a police officer and another victim whose identity they are not sharing with us.
And this is a Fox News alert. We're still waiting to get more confirmation about this so we can independently confirm it. But according to NPR, U.S. Representative Gabrielle Giffords of Arizona was shot outside a grocery store in Tucson while holding a public event there. Giffords, who was reelected to her 3rd term in November, was hosting her first Congress on Your Corner event at the Safeway in northwest Tucson when a gunman ran up and started shooting. At least 5 other people, according to this report, including members of her staff, were hurt.
Now confirmed from the Aurora Police Department, 14 people were killed this morning while watching the Batman movie. 10 died right there in the theater number 9. 4 people who were taken to the hospital died at the hospital. So a total of 14 moviegoers were killed this morning. At least 50 others who were in that theater were injured.
Good afternoon to all of you. I'm Diane Sawyer here at ABC News headquarters in New York, and we do have the breaking news of a shooting at an elementary school in Newtown, Connecticut. And you heard that right. It is unthinkable. An elementary school 45 miles southwest of Hartford. We know at least 3 victims are in the hospital at this hour in very serious condition.
How shootings are portrayed in the media often overlaps with biases and opinions about mental health in this country, as shown by these headlines. Over 30,000 people in the U.S. die by firearms each year. That's 88 deaths per day. Gunshot fatalities are the second leading cause of death after motor vehicle accidents. Of these deaths, approximately 2/3 are suicide and 1/3 are homicide. Based on media portrayal, you might think that most homicides were mass shootings. However, an exceedingly small percentage of gun deaths occur in the context of mass shootings. 934 people died in mass shootings in the last 7 years, less than 1% of all firearm homicides. Nevertheless, the rate of mass shootings has increased threefold since 2011, now occurring on an average of every 64 days. In the 30 years prior, a mass shooting occurred every 200 days. What is the role of the psychiatrist amid gun violence? We propose a 3-part answer. First, psychiatrist as an educator, not only of patients and family, but in the media as well. What is known about the relationship between violence and mental illness? In the U.S., only about 4% of violence is attributable to mental illness, and most of these violent acts do not involve firearms. One study found that persons with serious mental illness are actually no more likely to be violent unless they also have a substance abuse disorder or a prior history of violence. Indeed, repeated studies show that persons with mental illness are in fact significantly more likely to be the victims of crime and violence. However, negative public attitudes about persons with serious mental illness are pervasive and persistent. A 2013 U.S. national survey found that 46% of the population thought that persons with serious mental illness are far more likely to be dangerous than the general population, and only 30% of people were willing to have a person with mental illness as a work colleague or a neighbor. The link between mental illness and violence is far from clear. Nonetheless, high-profile shootings garner extensive media coverage, often drawing attention to an apparent link between gun violence and serious mental illness. In some cases, shooters truly have a previously diagnosed illness. Lacking a diagnosis, the media has been quick to suggest an undiagnosed mental illness despite vanishingly thin evidence. Not uncommonly, mental health providers are immediately implicated in the media, whether or not there is any data to support such a claim. There are a number of possible downstream effects of this sensational and reactionary approach to media coverage. The popular media is crucial to the public consciousness of persons with mental illness. Unfortunately, media images are rife with negative factors: danger, violence, criminality, and unpredictability. A retrospective analysis of newspaper coverage of mental illness between 2005 and 2010 found that out of 263 articles that mentioned mental health, danger, violence, and criminality were the direct subjects of 40% of the articles. Treatment, recovery, and rehabilitation were in less than 20%. The media's power could be used for good, however. Journalism experts believe that media can enhance affirming attitudes of mental illness or help promote social acceptance. Advocacy groups have prioritized educating journalists as a tool to decrease stigma. After a mass shooting, the public is bombarded with news coverage. This is over and above a 24-hour death-focused news cycle. At every tragedy, we all participate in what has been called a grim national ritual of shock, grief, and painful evaluation of details. The shooter's mental health is at the forefront of discussions, frequently speculative and sensationalistic. A refrain within news stories is, who is responsible? Guns? Access to guns? Mentally ill persons with guns? The public sees coverage of the mass shooting and proposed policies, which some studies have shown can heighten negative attitudes towards severe mental illness. Gun control advocates, view the wake of a mass shooting as an opportunity to amass support for stricter and perhaps ill-conceived gun control laws. Current legislation must target specific categories of dangerous people or dangerous weapons. The 1981 Brady Bill set forth a variety of conditions which would ban an individual from purchasing a firearm, including being adjudicated as mentally defective or committed to a mental institution. However, it's been suggested that policies banning individuals who have a mental illness and appear to be at harm to themselves by purchasing guns may have an unintended consequence of exacerbating stigma and deterring individuals from seeking help. So far, we've been talking about the media's portrayal of the relationship between violence and mental illness. But what about other visual media's direct effect on the occurrence of violent behavior? Let's look at children and youth. Children in the U.S. spend an average of 3 to 4 hours per day watching TV. 60% of the content of what they're watching contains violence, 84% of which is heavy violence. Looking closer at video games, 52% of children ages 8 to 18 play video games. Note that 95% of these video games contain violence. This is even excluding games that are in the most restricted category, M or mature. To illustrate what we're really talking about, here are some examples of what kids may encounter when playing video games. As you might imagine, exposure to these images and behaviors has profound consequences on the human mind. Playing violent video games is associated with increased aggressive behavior, affect, cognition, thoughts, beliefs, attitudes, increased physiological arousal, and a decrease in prosocial behavior. How this relates directly to violence is difficult to determine because violent behaviors are relatively infrequent and multiple factors contribute to the final outcome of violence. And as we'll see, the causal link between media violence and aggressive behavior is better established. You may be familiar with the term the Werther effect. This eponym for suicide contagion is from Goethe's 1774 novella, The Sorrows of Young Werther. The publication of this work of fiction was about a suicidal young man who, after the publication, it was followed by the deaths of young men in Europe emulating Werther. There is not a synonymous term for gun violence contagion or mass murder contagion, but lessons can be gleaned from the research into suicide contagion. Modern contagion studies by Phillips, Stack, and Gould have shown over and over three things. One, after a broadcast of death by suicide, suicide rates spike. Two, the increase in suicidal behavior is higher with a celebrity or political figure versus an average citizen, a real person versus a fictional person, and higher in the cohort that might perceive the suicidal individual as a peer. Three, reports of death affect vulnerable persons more. Phillips said, hearing about a suicide seems to make those who are vulnerable feel they have permission to do it. Efforts have been made to mitigate the contagion effect of media. In fact, there are news media and journalism guidelines published by the CDC, WHO, and NIMH about reporting on a death by suicide. I wish I could say that these are official rules that news media must abide by, but in the U.S., as in most countries, journalism codes are more thou shalt nots instead of laws. Their primary emphasis is that covering suicide carefully, even briefly, can change public misperceptions, correct myths, and encourage those who are vulnerable to seek help. Pictured here is the NIMH guidelines, and they've got, instead of this, do this chart for journalists. One example, instead of describing suicide as inexplicable or without warning, recognize that most but not all people who die by suicide exhibit warning signs. Bringing it back to gun violence and mass murder contagion, we have been dragging the media through the mud here, but they've tried to, albeit a little late. Following the Sandy Hook shootings in 2013, the Associated Press updated its style book with an entry on mental illness. A couple of highlights say, don't use derogatory terms such as insane, crazed, crazy, nuts, or deranged. Do not assume that mental illness is a factor in a violent crime and verify statements to that effect. A past history of mental illness is not necessarily a reliable indicator. What about psychiatrists? What can we do to quell contagion effects? How do we educate the public at large? How we frame the message is crucial. The APA Code of Ethics has a quote-unquote Goldwater rule forbidding psychiatrists from comment on an individual's mental state without a personal examination and authorization to comment. So, if there is a mass shooting and the media comes to you for an opinion, you could say something like, I can't comment on Isla Vista or Elliot Rodger. He was not my patient. I can say that mass shooting and suicide are nothing to romanticize. People who kill and then die by suicide were suffering. Their families and the families of their victims continue to suffer. Our role can be to shift the story to modifiable risk factors like media influence, psychiatric treatment, and access to care to disrupt the spread of contagion. I'll finish my section before giving it over to Sean with a clip of a mass shooting coverage in England in 2009. Included is a useful commentary by U.S. forensic psychiatrist and criminologist Dr. Park Dietz.
When I squint, I can just about make out the face of a killer. Isn't the news brilliant? Repeatedly showing us a killer's face isn't news, it's just rubbernecking. And what's more, this sort of coverage only serves to turn this murdering little twat into a sort of nihilistic pin-up boy.
One thing the news kept plaintively asking was why this had happened.
Why? What had triggered in the mind of a seemingly normal teenager such fury and alienation?
Well, if you want to know why not ask a forensic psychiatrist?
We've had 20 years of mass murders, throughout which I have repeatedly told CNN and our other media, if you don't want to propagate more mass murders, don't start the story with sirens blaring.
The school day had only just begun when the attacker struck.
Don't have photographs of the killer.
The 17-year-old's 3-hour rampage ended in his own death.
Don't make this 24/7 coverage.
The German Chancellor is about to give her reaction. We'll bring that to you live.
Do everything you can not to make the body count the lead story.
Carnage in the classroom, 16 people are dead.
Not to make the killer some kind of anti-hero.
Dressed in black combat gear, the gunman opened fire at random.
Do localize this story to the affected community and make it as boring as possible in every other market. Because every time we have intense saturation coverage of a mass murder, we expect to see one or two more within a week.
But I mean, hold on a second here.
In summary then, not only does bad news always trump good news, but that bad news might itself actually help create more bad news, which is good news if you're the news.
Hi, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. Sean Sassano, and it's also a pleasure to be talking to you guys about whether or not psychiatrists truly are the protectors of the public, given the current laws and systems that are in place right now. So just to kind of give you an overview of what we're going to be talking about, we're going to talk about gun control laws and the mentally ill, specifically possession, reporting, the database that information gets reported to, and then also the appeals process. We're also going to talk about violence risk assessment. I'm going to start, and then my colleague Sarah Weekly is going to be finishing this up. But I'm going to talk about violence risk assessment and talking about how well trained are psychiatrists in violence risk assessment. So when it comes to gun possession, a recurring theme that you're going to see throughout this is that statutes really vary state by state for just about everything. Can you guys hear me? Okay. Let's see if this goes any higher. I'll speak into the mic a little bit more. I'll be stooped over for the duration of this presentation. Is that okay? All right, very good. So really statutes vary state by state in terms of the laws that they have around gun possession. So there is the Federal Gun Control Act, which says that anybody who's an unlawful user or addicted to a substance or has been adjudicated as mentally defective or committed to a mental institution, they are not allowed to have a gun. And there are some states that default to the federal gun control law. And these states are Colorado, Idaho, New Mexico, Vermont, and New Hampshire. I have the state flags over there on the side for those of you that are interested in what the state flags look like. I am partial to New Mexico there in the middle. Now, Hawaii actually has one of the most inclusive gun control laws out there. I put this one up here because it's so interesting in how far they go. We have their state flags up there as well. The one on the right is the traditional Hawaiian flag. The one on the left may be a little bit reminiscent of Great Britain's flag, and that's because during review of this presentation, I found out that Great Britain actually did own Hawaii for a short period of time before the United States took them over. So when making up their state flag, they wanted to put the Union Jack along with the Stars and Stripes. So that's where that flag came from. So in Hawaii, anybody that's addicted to a substance, abuses a substance, or is dependent on a substance, or has any DSM at the writing of this for diagnosis is excluded from having a gun. That's a much more inclusive law than some of the other states have. So when does the psychiatrist get involved? This is the mandated reporting. So this varies state by state. You're going to see this again and again. Okay? So in Massachusetts, there we have their flag, and then also their flower, which is the Mayflower. Anytime someone is confined to a hospital for mental illness or is engaged in drug or alcohol treatment, the psychiatrist is mandated to report. In California, there's our flag and the poppy, which is our flower. Any admission to a hospital for danger to others or danger to self, for voluntary or involuntary process. Where does this information go? Well, varies state by state. 20 states, including DC and Puerto Rico, have state mental health data banks. This does not necessarily lead to the transfer of information between states. 43 states authorize reporting to the National Instant Criminal Background Check System. This is what was established by the Brady Act. All handgun dealers are required to check the NICS, regardless of what state it is. That's not all firearms. So in some states, you can buy a rifle without needing to check the NICS. So you might ask, why not all 50 states and territories? Why don't they all have to report? This is actually a Supreme Court decision. So in 1997, in Prince versus the U.S., the federal government, the Supreme Court said the federal government cannot force states to submit records to the NICS. They did say that they can block federal funding and encourage states to report, but they said that you can't mandate that. So I'm not going to go through all the states, but these are the states that authorize or require reporting of mental health records directly to the NICS, and I'll leave it up there just for a moment to see if, so that you can see if your state is up there. It's in alphabetical order. So these are the states that have in-state databases only. Now this doesn't mean they don't report to the NICS, but the law doesn't specifically address this. So in my own state of California, I thought that we were reporting to the NICS. Turns out we're not. We send the records to a state database, and the NICS does eventually get them when they request the records from us. But they just kind of sit somewhere until the Department of Justice calls and asks us for them. So you may ask, well, how soon do I need to report? And again, big range. So in Florida, Mississippi, Texas, and Utah, you have 30 days to report. It's quite a long time. In Virginia, they say as soon as practicable, but no later than the close of the business on the following business day. So they actually have a pretty quick time requirement, whereas in Wisconsin, sufficiently vague at in a timely manner. How is this information transmitted? Well, again, varies state by state, but I did want to talk about Connecticut, which really has a model system at this point. So pre-Sandy Hook, courts faxed involuntary commitments to the State Department of Public Safety and then separately to the NICS. And I think we all know from faxing things that we're not sure where they end up and what eventually happens to those documents. But that's how they did things. Now what they have is an electronic system that updates the State Department of Public Safety and the NICS at the same time. So in terms of what the NICS looks like, so this is data from up until December 31st of 2013. And here we have 11.2 or so million records in the system. And what we see is mental health accounts for almost 30% of those records. The adjudicated mental health, a large proportion, and then a smaller proportion as the unlawful user or addicted to a controlled substance. In terms of the denials for gun possession, this actually goes up to a couple of weeks ago. 10% of the denials are due to mental health reasons, and actually a large percentage of that 10% is really due to addiction to a controlled substance, with only a little over 1% being due to adjudicated mental health reasons. So in looking at the appeals process for gun ownership, well, the federal law does say that we have to provide something. In the amendment to the Brady Act, they said that any person who believes that they were unlawfully or wrongly denied a firearm, they can appeal this. So again, the appeals process varies state by state. So in Massachusetts, for instance, you can be considered for firearms licensure as soon as a registered physician says you're not disabled or you're cured of such a condition by a licensed physician. Okay? That's in sharp contrast to Rhode Island, and there we have their flower, the viola, and a picture of Newport. In Rhode Island, 5 years from the date that you're pronounced cured, you're then allowed to submit an affidavit that says that you're no longer dangerous and you're a proper person to possess a firearm. So very different statute. So in terms of risk assessment, when it's time to evaluate for firearms possessions and appeals for possession, are clinicians adequately trained, and how predictive are violence risk assessment measures? So let's start with the first question, are clinicians adequately trained? Well, I should start by saying that psychiatrists are expected by the public and certifying agencies, that being the ABPN, to adequately assess for risk for violence. However, trainees and program directors report insufficient education in violence risk assessment. So this is actually some data from the Work Psychiatry Committee, and I want to thank all of you for participating in our survey and helping pass out the survey, but I wanted to share this with you. This is one of our questions that we gave to residents. PGY3 and PGY4 residents, 96 of them from 22 different programs, were asked this question. So a local manufacturing floor manager receives a threatening call. They talk to HR. They're not satisfied with what HR says, and they say, well, I'm going to call the local hospital for help. I'm going to look for a psychiatrist. We ask the resident to pretend that they're the psychiatrist who's on call. How confident are you in your ability to evaluate that workplace threat? Not a single person said they were very confident. Now, again, this is a bit of a loaded question, but what we see is a even split between not at all confident, slightly confident, and moderately confident. And the writing's a little bit small, so the not at all would be the top, slightly would be the middle, and moderately would be the bottom bar there. But we would hope that at least that would be skewed a little bit more towards moderately, but we're not seeing that. So let's go back to that question. Are clinicians adequately trained in violence risk assessment? No, at least not when nearing completion of residency. However, there is some good news. Curriculum for residency training has been discussed, and we're actually discussing it as well as part of our group, but it's been discussed in reference to this in the past. And there is at least a couple of studies that training in violence risk assessment does increase the resident's ability to that of attendings. The question then becomes, well, how good are attendings? And so this is where I'm going to pass it over to my colleague, Sarah Weekly. Thank you very much.
Okay, hi everyone. So I have the pleasure of being able to discuss the role as a psychiatrist that's probably most familiar to all of us, which is the psychiatrist as clinician. So in doing so, we wanted to consider not just the treatment for the violent offenders, but also for the victims of violence. So I'm going to go quickly through both of those things, starting with the other side of what Sean was talking about. So when we're evaluating whether or not a person is at risk for violence, and therefore, whether or not they should be allowed access to firearms, the first question was, are the clinicians adequately trained to assess risk for violence? But then, does that even matter? That's the second part of the question. How predictive are these violence risk assessment measures? And this is especially apropos because risk assessment tools are being increasingly required by courts and correctional agencies. And as with suicide risk assessments and other risk assessment tools, I wouldn't be surprised, and we are seeing this more and more often, that formalized risk assessment measures may be required in our hospitals, in the emergency room, in inpatient units, and likely even outpatient facilities. Okay, so I have 2 super texty slides. I apologize in advance, but don't worry, there's going to be little red circles, and I'm going to announce everything that's important. So there are 2 different studies that we looked at for this. The first one was this study that was done in 2011. They're both meta-analyses. This one looked at 35 studies with, oh, I forgot I have this right in front of me. Okay. This one looked at 35 studies that looked at a total of over 11,000 patients, and they looked at, they looked at a variety of commonly used risk assessment tools. So some of them, I'm just going to list a few: the HCR20, the VRAG, the VRS, things that some of us may have been familiar with. And they looked at a variety of different patient populations. So most of the studies were looking at heterogeneous samples of patients with a variety of mental illnesses, but some of them broke it down more by psychosis, mental retardation, mood disorders, etc. So the key, though, is that the way they were assessing the efficacy of these risk assessment tools was that they were looking at the area under the curve. And if you guys remember from statistics, which I had to get a refresher on, if you have an area under the curve of 0.5, that's essentially no efficacy, same as chance. It's not very predictive at all. Whereas if you have an area under the curve of 1, that's perfect, right? Like, you score positive on this risk assessment tool, you are going to go hurt someone. So as you can see, it's highlighted on the bottom, the range of the area under the curves for these risk assessment tools was 0.62 to 0.85. So you can see, not perfect, but there is some predictive value in using these tools. So that was encouraging. Okay, so here's the second busy slide. This one was looking at, so we have the structured tools that are being formulated, but then we also have clinician judgment, right? And what do we look at when we're going through our interviews for a risk assessment? We look for risk factors. And so this looked at various risk factors that psychiatrists often screen for in their clinical interviews, looking for, whether or not someone is at risk for committing violence. So this was a meta-analysis done in 2013. They looked at a total of 110 studies with over 45,000 patients. So as you'll see, the way they evaluated the efficacy of each of these risk factors in predicting violence was using random effects pooled odds ratios. And they looked at a variety of risk factors. I'll just read out a few of them for those who are, most of you who are probably having difficulty reading this. So the one that scored the highest was history of assault, probably not surprisingly, with a pooled odds ratio of 21.4. Very significant. Other high ones were high scores on the aggression against others subscale, not surprisingly, and higher aggression scores. So all of those make sense. Somewhere in the middle, you see things like recent arrests, meets criteria for psychopathy, hostility, and then more towards the bottom, the lowest risk factors odds ratio was 1.2, and that was for a younger age at first criminal offense. So some useful data in terms of where we should target our clinical interviews. Okay, so once we've assessed someone to be at risk for violence, what are their treatment options? Or once we've encountered a patient who has already committed a violent act, what are our treatment options? So these are some of the things that I actually pulled off the Department of Justice studies and websites. So for offenders with a mental illness, the most commonly used type of treatment is psychiatric medication. And I want to point out that these are offenders with a diagnosed mental illness. Often these are antipsychotics. Also commonly, patients will undergo substance abuse treatment if that's indicated. And then probably what's most relevant to me as an emergency room psychiatrist, there's the decision point of if this person needs a higher level of supervision and care, such as an inpatient admission, PHP, something like that, a more restrictive measure. So then for juvenile offenders, we'll talk a little bit more about multisystemic therapy, but just wanted to point out that it's very important to include parents, and this is one of the forms of treatment that makes sure to involve parents in the treatment of the juvenile offenders. They often tend to also have programming focused on building their self-esteem and their self-image. And then, of course, just like with adults, if they have a dual diagnosis or they have a mental illness that would benefit from psychopharmacology, those are obviously treatment options. But what I want to talk about in a little bit more detail is the standard of care according to, most thought that I came across when researching this topic, which is cognitive behavioral therapy. So when looking at Lipsy's review of 548 studies, which the studies ranged from 1958 to 2002, so huge range in when these were performed, they found pretty definitively that programs based on punishment and deterrence actually increased recidivism. So that's a little bit of a sad statement, knowing how our correctional facilities work currently and our juvenile, or not just juvenile, our justice system works currently. Instead, they found that approaches based on skill building and coordinating support had the greatest impact in reducing recidivism. So specifically, CBT skill building was the most effective intervention. But they made sure to point out results were the best when CBT was combined with more psychosocial supports. So when they had vocational training, when they had additional education, and when the patients also had access to on-site kind of as-needed mental health counseling and support. So what are some of the targets of CBT? A lot of this is going to look familiar to everyone, but just going through quickly. We want to educate the patient on developmentally appropriate behaviors. We want to go through problem-solving exercises. We want to mentalize the effects of one's behaviors on others and learn how to express empathy. We want to help these patients determine who and how to trust. We want them to learn how to accept blame when it's appropriate, decrease their entitled cognitions, improve their impulse control, and help them communicate with words rather than force. These forms of CBT for patients who are violent offenders include an anger management component, and the methods used to target anger management is teaching patients to recognize their level of arousal, encourage them to perform a cognitive appraisal of the situation leading to the arousal, so they can do a chain analysis of what happened, then to use relaxation techniques to help them physiologically de-escalate themselves, and to self-instruct themselves on an appropriate behavioral response that does not include violence. I just want to point out a quick caveat that was mentioned, which is that it's very important to appropriately group patients and offenders, because treatment losses have been reported when low-risk offenders are given the high-risk treatment regimen and are placed in groups with people who are more prone to violence that can actually backfire and have low-risk offenders be more likely to commit more violent acts. Okay, so I'm also a child psychiatrist, so I have a specific interest in juvenile offenders, and so functional family therapy is a very important piece of treatment for juvenile offenders, with specific goals of increasing parental supervision, working on conflict resolution within the family, and also developing and nurturing those emotional attachments. And the bonus for taking this sort of approach with juvenile offenders is that you have the added benefit of reducing delinquency in siblings as well as other family members. So more bang for your buck. Okay, so what about the other side of the coin? What about the victims of violence? How about when your patient comes in or you are asked to intervene in a population that's been exposed to something really traumatic? So one of the formalized types of treatment is called psychological first aid, and we're going to go over some of the principles of that in just a minute. But it's basically an early response to the emotional needs of those affected by a major traumatic event. And this is actually in contrast to psychological debriefing, which actually has been shown to worsen stress symptoms in some people and does not prevent post-traumatic psychological effects of disaster. So just to point out what the difference is, psychological debriefing tends to focus on having patients recount what happened to them, often in a group setting, which can be pretty traumatizing, especially when it happens too early for that patient. Early reconnection of victims with their family, their social supports, and also known resources is also extremely effective in facilitating recovery. And that's a part of psychological first aid, which we'll get to. Okay, so what are the 8 goals of psychological first aid? Number 1, you want to contact and engage. You want to establish that human connection, build rapport, be non-intrusive, be compassionate. Then you want to ensure safety and comfort, right? First things first, you need to make sure they're immediately physically safe and also provide them with support. You want to stabilize them, so calm them and orient them emotionally. You want to gather information, so find out, what do these people need? What do they feel like their needs and concerns are? And then provide that. So provide them with practical assistance. You also then want to focus on connecting them. So first with their own social support networks, as well as with, sorry, I'm skipping to 8, linking them with collaborative services. You want to support their coping. You want to empower them so that they can take an active role in their own recovery. And you also want to make sure that they are going to have continuity of their services after your intervention is complete if you're not going to continue to treat them. Okay, so now we've gone over 3 kind of umbrella categories as how psychiatrists can act in relationship to gun violence. And so what are some of the conclusions? I'm just going to go through a quick review of some of the take-home points for our discussions. So for psychiatrists as educator, when communicating with the media, we want to maintain objectivity and try not to contribute to the sensationalization of the story. We want to keep in mind that most people with mental illness are not violent, and most people who commit violent acts do not have mental illness. We want to refrain from making diagnoses based on past history, background information, or media reports. We want to direct media outlets to the NIMH and the Associated Press guidelines for coverage of violence. And when we think about the media, we want to remember that media coverage can often fuel further violence and/or suicides. And while video games may increase aggression and decrease prosocial behavior, we're still not sure exactly what that link is. So in terms of the psychiatrist as a protector, we have some recommendations for law reform. We'd like to encourage consistent definition and criteria for mental illnesses to be held by all states. We want to provide incentives for states to report to NICS, and we'd like to encourage a consistent reporting time frame across states, as well as the use of immediately uploadable electronic reporting. In terms of risk assessments, we want to recognize that risk assessment tools are imperfect, but evolving in utility. We also want to make sure to assess for history of assault or aggressiveness, as this is the risk factor that correlates best with future aggression or violent behavior. And we'd like to see a curriculum developed for residency training programs to make sure that all trainees know how to assess for violence. And then finally, the psychiatrist as clinician, we want to make sure that treatments for perpetrators of violence are appropriate, remembering that CBT currently is the standard of care with a strong evidence base in the literature, but remembering also that it's best when combined with psychosocial support training, psychosocial supports and training, and also that juvenile offenders should receive family-based treatment, as well as potentially programs focused on their self-esteem and self-image. And then for victims of violence, we want to remember the tenets of psychological first aid, which I'm not going to repeat because you just saw them. Here are some of our references and some of the state laws that we slogged through. And we just wanted to say a huge thank you for having us. It's been an amazing 2 years, and we all feel really privileged. So I want to invite our whole class up so we can actually give you guys a round of applause for being our mentors. Dr. Barber is going to help us out with facilitating questions. And comments. We like comments.
I was wondering if you all have thought about prevention of violence, what you can do with patients to prevent future violence, and also what you can do about activities in emergency rooms about preventing gun violence.
How do you feel about those issues? Any volunteers among us?
I could say, like, you guys need to Well, I think that some of the principles that we saw in terms of the skill building are things that can be done not necessarily just in like a 16-session CBT sort of format, but those are skills that we can work with patients even in the emergency room in terms of, recognizing arousal, thinking of alternative solutions, and just working on their general coping skills. I think that's something that we can do for anyone. So that would be one first thought. Always ask if there's a gun at home. I don't know.
Yeah, that's one of the things I was going to get at. I mean, one thing we didn't really cover in this is sort of gun control as a policy in this country. We thought it might have been a little bit beyond our scope. And then, even as psychiatrists, that someone is having a homicidal impulse, then they do have a firearm. What recourse do you have at that moment? Legally, there's not much. You can enlist the support of family of the patient or friends of the patient, someone that can get access to it and secure it, but you really don't. You're hampered in a way, and so it opens up an entire another Pandora's box of opinions and thoughts about this. So we didn't address that directly.
Thank you for a wonderful presentation. I learned a lot, and you obviously put a lot into it. So. Great presentation. I'd like to make a comment about suicide and access to guns, getting back to this whole question. You mentioned in the report that 20,000 gun deaths were by suicide. That's half of all suicides, a little more than half of all suicides in this country, and twice as many as homicides. And there's a great deal of evidence that access to guns is key to the suicide rate. Just take the lethality of guns. If you try to kill yourself by a gun, you're 90% successful. If you try to kill yourself with an overdose, you're about 5% successful. And there's much evidence that easier access to guns, or the prevalence of guns, is highly related to the suicide rate. The state that has the highest suicide rate in this country is Wyoming, and then Alaska. There was a recent study in Switzerland where they decided not to allow returning veterans from their all-volunteer but 100% military service. They were not allowing them to take their guns home. And the suicide rate in Switzerland fell by half. So gun control, access to guns, means reduction, I think is the most important thing from our perspective. And just say, in Maryland, when we had the gun control legislation in the wake of Newtown, I was called by the Governor's Commission and asked, what criteria in terms of mental illness would you restrict access to guns? And my answer was, anybody who drives by Shepherd Pratt should not have access to guns.
I completely agree, and those statistics are compelling. My question then to the group is, how do we get that message out that doesn't inflame a gun rights lobby?
Hi, thank you. That was a very good presentation. Obviously, you did your homework, and it was really well presented. Thank you. Actually, I find some of these issues to be a little bit of an ethical dilemma in terms of confidentiality. So I'll just sort of describe what that is. So I'm from Connecticut. Yes, we did have the Newtown disaster. And some of the legislation has to do with prohibiting people from buying guns that have either voluntarily or involuntarily been hospitalized, and I as a psychiatrist need to give their names to a national registry. So NICS, you send them there. Do I want people to have guns? No. But do I want a patient to not come to the hospital and get the help they need because they think they'll be on a national registry? That seems a little problematic as well. So I thought I would bring up that, sort of how do we think about that as psychiatrists when we want guns out of the hands of people so that people are safe? On the other hand, sending names of anyone that we treat voluntarily or involuntarily seems like a real lapse of confidentiality.
I think that's a really great point, and it's reminded me of another element that we weren't able to cover in our talk, which is guns in the military. and mental illness. And just the broad idea of having to fight against someone who doesn't seek help because they don't want to suffer the consequences of that help, which in this case would be losing their access to guns, losing their livelihood. It's a very complicated issue. Anyone else have any comments about it? Thank you.
Hi, I'm Deborah Pinels from Massachusetts, and I want to applaud you for taking on a very, very, very complicated topic and doing some really a nice piece of work kind of covering the gamut of issues that you saw as relevant. Just last weekend, I spent at the assembly of the APA where we debated a position statement, and for those of you that aren't aware, the APA has really struggled with some of these very same issues related to how to balance the idea of gun control versus stigma of these, gun control and safety and the suicide issues that I think Steve so nicely talked about versus these databases that are highly stigmatizing and not clearly so effective, actually, when you think about the fact that many of the recent incidents of mass murder involve people who were accessing guns through their parents, through illegally and whatnot. And so there's all sorts of questions about how these databases will actually work. So people should look at the APA website. There's a resource guide. There's a position statement from last year. There's going to hopefully be, when it goes to the Board of Trustees in December, a new position statement as well that will update everybody on some of these current laws. But I guess I'm asking, what I'd like to ask you as residents is to help us understand what it is that you're actually being taught besides, do you have a gun? And my concern is that we're not doing a good job teaching these issues because we don't know what to do, as you said, when the answer is, yes, I have a gun. Sometimes it's limited. Sometimes there's states that have mandates about what you're supposed to do. But most of the time, the risk management is as complex as the risk assessment, and I'm not sure how much residencies are really tackling that related to firearms. There's very little literature on, what you're supposed to do if the patient says yes to the question of, do you have a gun? So can somebody just describe, what are you getting much of that? Are you getting firearms seminars, anything in your residencies?
So I would say that probably varies depending on the residency. In my residency program, we have to ask every patient that we see either on a consult or for an H&P whether they have a gun at home. And if the answer is yes to that question, we typically then have to look at the risk involved. Is there a history of violence or is there a history of suicide? And how strong is their intent for suicide, or what is their situation when they're admitted? If the case is yes, they have a gun at home, then we typically request to the patient to report that to a family member. The family member then can secure the gun and get it out of the home. Usually if a patient comes in involuntarily, then we typically have a little bit more wiggle room with contacting families regarding the patient's care in terms of confidentiality, and can then request the guns be removed. In terms of at the VA hospital, we have gun locks, and there are also risk assessment and suicide risk assessment and homicide risk assessment social workers that can kind of help us figure out what are the logistics of doing this. So we do have a little bit of that help, but again, it's going to vary by state. It's probably going to vary by residency program. And also, when it comes to the laws regarding confidentiality and removal of guns from the home, typically we look to family members or other support for that patient, and if they don't have that support, how do we then go about removing that access? So I think that's where things get a little bit cloudy. What we've always said in our program is if we're taken to court for removing somebody's guns, we'd rather stand against, having, the breach of confidentiality but insurance of safety than go against the other way of, I didn't want to breach confidentiality, yet this person was a dangerous person. So we always err on the side of trying to remove the risk where we can.
And just adding to that, it was really trained, or rather the trainees in my program were really accustomed to this idea that you had to ask about gun access. That we were taught essentially that one of my mentors is a guy named Tom Gutile, who some of you may know, and he said essentially he won't take a forensic psychiatry case if the psychiatrist has not asked about access to firearms, because it demonstrates a basic inadequacy in the interview. And so since that time, since I heard that, I always ask, and then what to do with that information is a much more complicated issue.
So I want to congratulate the presenters. I really learned a lot. Before I make my comment, I want to say I'm not an anti-gun person. I was a gun hobbyist as a kid. I used to be in gun organizations. In the military, I enjoyed using my M16. But I think the problem with the media and the public attention to psychiatrists reporting every patient who might be dangerous so they can't purchase the gun is it gives us politically a false sense of having done something when in fact it's the availability of guns to everyone is the reason for the high degree of victim injury by guns. Statistically, mental ill patients have a slightly increased chance of using a gun if they have access to it, but it doesn't account for the big numbers. And I think as psychiatrists who want to do advocacy,
a very charged issue, and I want to congratulate you. Some of the thoughts that I did have on this, and they're fourfold. One is the use of the gun reporting laws. One of the problems that I've seen in my state is that even though the state is required to report commitments, et cetera, to the NCIS, recently became aware of a person who was able to purchase a gun while in the state hospital. So what I had learned that in fact, although they're required to report, the state does not report to the NCIS. So there are difficulties with enforcement of law that come up, and that's something not to overlook. Another piece on this that has come up is there are those people when they hear the comment, well, only 4% of people involved with violent acts have mental illness. They say, what percentage of mass shootings? And I think that is an open question because those issues have been high prevalence in the mass shooting cases. And hopefully someone goes back and quantifies that and investigates that. The third part is the larger cultural factors because we live in a culture that for a large part sees violence as a way to resolve problems. I don't think it's a coincidence that 4 out of 44 American presidents have been killed by gunshot wounds. Those are 9% of American presidents have been assassinated. And there's the other link in a larger cultural sense that the #1 source of manufacturing revenue in the United States, the biggest sector within the manufacturing sector, is arms manufacturing. Our wealth really has been built on building killing machines. So there is a lot of the predisposition to violence, the glorification, the embodiment to it that goes right to the heart of our economic and cultural existence. But thank you. Very nice report.
Thank you.
Just two things. The one, Paul Fink would agree with Dr. Sharfstein's, though. That is, we don't address guns and suicide. All the focus is on guns and homicide. Definitely, suicide is the major issue. The second thing, I want to read this one and then say something about it at the end. In the long term, the violent crime in the United States has been in decline since colonial times. However, during the early 20th century, crime rates in the United States were higher compared to parts of Western Europe. After World War II, the crime rates increased in the United States, peaking in the 70s and early 90s. But since the 90s, however, the crime in the United States has declined steeply. So my question is, this is exactly what NRA is going to say. What you're saying about all those things doesn't translate into numbers. By the way, even the school violence is a half today when compared to 70s. So it's an interesting dilemma for us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Mark Manso. I'm from New York City. I've actually done a lot of advocacy around gun violence prevention through various organizations. including Doctors for America, which Vivek Murthy started, and he's the current Surgeon General nominee who's being sort of held up because of his rather reasonable positions on gun violence. So I just wanted to make a few points after following up on your excellent presentation on the prevention side, gun violence prevention. First of all, it doesn't matter what kind of reporting laws we have if they're not used. And even though 90% of Americans and 70% of NRA members support universal background checks, it wasn't able to get past a filibuster in the Senate shortly after Newtown. The second thing is I completely agree with Dr. Sharfstein that we need to shift our focus more towards suicide. And then I also think on the violence perspective, I think we as psychiatrists need to shift the perspective away from serious mental illness because the factors which are most associated with risk of violence are history of assault, misdemeanor assault included, which is not included in the background check, history of alcohol abuse, and history of temporary restraining order. And none of that's included in the NICS. So those are things we can also point out when making comments at the media to try to divert the attention away from serious mental illness, which is something that I've tried to do whenever I've advocated.
Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Collins Lewis. I'm from St. Louis. And I just wanted to remind everybody that the media is not necessarily our friend. Because if you think of the media, how do papers make their money? They sell more papers. And if you have something sensational, you're going to sell more papers. And the same with the TV. How do they make their money? If more people watch one channel, they can charge more for commercials, etc. So they basically make money by, charging more, selling more papers. So to them, maybe sensationalizing things will get them more money. So I just wanted to make that comment.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bob Like from New Jersey. A film documentary maker in the New York area had recently approached me about trying to reframe the discussion about gun violence to also gun as a public health issue and a safety issue, and also spending time talking to the NRA and lobbyists as well as to folks more on the gun control side. So my question to the group is, if you were invited by the NRA or others to give this presentation, what would you keep? What would you change? What would you add? And can psychiatrists play the role of corpus callosum between the different sides? Your thoughts on that?
My first thought is I'd like something like they have in the NFL once the refs are done with the game and they load them into a car and get them out of there as soon as possible.
I'd like to think about that more. Yeah.
So I think we can all agree that was extremely comprehensive and thought-provoking. We could probably stay here and talk for a while longer. I'm going to present the certificates to the fellows now, and since we have a photographer here, it's perfect. So come on up when you hear your name, Nicholas Badre. Teresa Clemens. David Freeman. Yael Holishitz. Sarah Roth. Sackman. Sean Sassano-Higgins. Anup Sharma. Adam Stern. Sarah Weekly. Justine Wittenauer. And Yvonne Yang. Yeah, thank you, everybody.